One of the most interesting parts about George R. R. Martin's characterization of villains specifically is he rarely writes purely black and white evil villains. Now, I know that might sound kind of insane just to say out loud, considering we have some of the most vile people in media in A Song of Ice and Fire, but hear me out. For the most part, every single main villain that we have in the story has some portion of their character that is rooted in some amount of sympathy, or some amount of humanity. The first example that comes to mind, and one that everyone loves to talk about, is Joffrey Baratheon. Now, most people just simply view Joffrey as an evil little shit. He's a character that kills people for fun, loves to torture animals, and just loves to be an awful human being for all intents and purposes. And that is very true. Joffrey is definitely evil by all accounts. He is a terrible person. But with that being said, there is a sympathetic portion of his character that George intentionally puts in there so you can see that while this character is evil, what makes him evil isn't this grand other thing, it's the fact that he's a human being. One of the things about Joffrey that often gets overlooked is the environment that he is brought up in. Joffrey is not only babied by Cersei, but his terrible actions are actually encouraged by Cersei. Cersei actually gets frustrated in A Feast for Crows when Tommen isn't as brutal and harsh as Joffrey, and she constantly praises her son. So every negative trait that Joffrey has is reinforced with positivity from the only true parental figure in his life, since Robert Baratheon isn't present at all in his life and doesn't really want anything to do with his son. There is this really terrible moment that we hear about where Joffrey found a cat that had babies and gutted the cat to present the kittens to Robert, and Robert smacked him. But what's really interesting about this, and what not a lot of people talk about, is the fact that one of the reasons Joffrey is so brutal is because he idolizes his father and idolizes the brutality that his father had during Robert's rebellion. Robert is famous for his strength and his brutality and the way he killed Rhaegar at the Trident and smashed his chest in and all the rubies spilt everywhere. Robert was this massive, imposing force, and Joffrey has huge shoes to fill with that being his father. So he tries to, in his own really weird and messed up way, live up to his father's image and ideas by being really cruel and really brutal. And this is only worsened by the fact that when he would do this, such as with the kittens, Robert would punish him or just want nothing to do with him. There was never actually any true course correction with Joffrey where someone sat him down and really explained to him what he was doing was wrong. Instead, he got the opposite treatment where everything that he did that was terrible was reinforced. George R. R. Martin really likes to play with the ideas of nature versus nurture. And while there are definitely some traits from Joffrey, maybe due to the incest or just due to his genetic pool, that maybe predisposed him to being insane or terrible or awful more than other people, that nurture aspect, the chance that he had to be raised properly, wasn't really there. It is no coincidence that Cersei is the closest with Joffrey, and Joffrey ends up by far the most malicious out of all of her children. Now, while some people may not consider this canon, there is this phenomenal scene at the end of Season 1 where Robert is talking to Joffrey, and he tells him that one of his regrets is not being a better father to him, not being closer to him, because he feels that if he did a better job as a parent, Joffrey would have been a better king and a better man. And it just takes it a step further in showing you that Joffrey, while definitely evil, is not black and white evil. He's not Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars, for as far as I know, is just doing it for the love of the game. There is some sympathetic backstory to Joffrey, at bare minimum, an explanation as to why he ends up the way that he does. And I also believe this is why he kills Ned. Joffrey was raised with his brutality and raised with the idea of his father and the support of his mother that being brutal and killing your enemies is the way to do things. So he reenacts it with Ned, and that's what sparks the War of the Five Kings. Now, this next character that I want to talk about is actually one that I've talked about in depth 2 months ago now, and people were not happy with what I had to say, but I really do stand behind it. Ramsay Bolton, while another evil character, is not evil without explanation. One of my favorite moments in A Dance with Dragons related to Ramsay Bolton is when Theon notes that Ramsay is at his cruelest after he is made fun of, bullied, or put down by his father or by someone else. And this explains why Ramsay is so cruel in general. Ramsay is a bastard, which means he is looked down upon by everyone else. And he absolutely hates it. Whenever this happens to him, he feels like shit. So what he does, which is awful, is he takes people and lowers them so far beneath him that in comparison, he feels like a god. I believe he does this as a way to kind of equal the scales to him being born a bastard, but then making people so far beneath him that he gets raised to where he believes he should be, that being nobility. Granted, his methods are terrible. This is not a defense of Ramsay or Joffrey, but simply their characters being so brutal are there with some type of human explanation behind them. Not to mention the fact that Ramsay is born as a product of rape. Roose Bolton rapes his mother beneath the hanging corpse of the man that she loved. That is horrifying, and this is something that Roose goes out of his way to remind Ramsay whenever he steps out of line. And this line specifically is one of the most brutal and vile lines I've ever heard a father give to their son in media. Get the keys and remove those chains from him before you make me rue the day I raped your mother. That is just unbelievably vile, and anyone who would hear this would obviously be mentally and emotionally traumatized by having to experience this type of existence. I'm not saying Ramsay is justified, but it's just an explanation of how he ends up the way that he does. And this extends to many other characters as well. A lot of people view Tywin Lannister as this vile monster, which he is. Tywin is a piece of shit who ruins hundreds of thousands of people's lives, both directly and indirectly, and allows so much terrible shit to happen throughout the Seven Kingdoms and just the world at large. But what's really interesting is when we get to the backstory for Tywin, we're shown a somewhat sympathetic, but at bare minimum, human explanation as to why Tywin Lannister ended up the way that he did. Tywin didn't just wake up all big and mad one day. It turns out that he has this deep and dark insecurity about being laughed at, about being beneath other people, and everything that he does is informed by that insecurity, which makes him a massive hypocrite, but also makes him incredibly interesting. I guarantee you that at a point in time when Tywin was a very young boy, if we were placed in his head, got to see things from his perspective, we would come away feeling bad and possibly even rooting for some of the decisions that he makes. Not the bad ones, but I'm saying very specifically when he's a child before he does any of the terrible shit. I guarantee you there is a point there where you would have a lot of sympathy for that character. And I think no character better showcases what George R. R. Martin is trying to say with sympathetic villains more than Tyrion Lannister. George has gone on record saying that Tyrion's arc is one of an emerging supervillain. This is a character that we get to see go through everything. And at the start of a Game of Thrones versus the end of A Dance with Dragons, we are faced with two entirely different characters. Tyrion, by the end of Dance, is a terrible, deplorable, awful, vile villain who sexually assaults people, rapes people, is trying to burn down the Seven Kingdoms, and wants to assault his sister for fun. This is a vile monster. But because we've been with him for 5 books now, because we've seen his arc unfold, we see what he experiences, how he is treated, the way in which he is brutalized and horribly embarrassed and just treated by his family. We understand that this is not a one-note villain. This is not Emperor Palpatine just doing it for the love of the game. This is a man who has been traumatized, who has been harmed, and there is sympathy to be found there. But if you don't have sympathy for him, at bare minimum you have to understand this is a human being. This is not some monster. This is not some cosmic deity. This is a man that has been pushed to the brink and is making awful decisions. Now granted, there are some exceptions to this rule. there really isn't ever a good explanation given as to why the Mountain is just such a terrible piece of shit. The only explanation we're ever given is that he has these cluster headaches. He's just insanely painful headaches that make him rageful, but that is not nearly enough to explain the brutality that he demonstrates. I think he's a rare example in A Song of Ice and Fire of just a black and white evil character that's there for the sake of being evil and being a big, angry, brutal knight. Well, there's also the fact that he's meant to demonstrate how knighthood has collapsed, but in terms of his actual individual character, he's just there to be evil. And then the other outlier is Euron Greyjoy. Euron is definitely a product of his environment, being Ironborn, being raised in the very brutal, very harsh culture. But with that being said, he pushes against his culture very often, and the things that he does, he seems to be just doing it for the love of the game. If there was any just purely evil, big bad character in A Song of Ice and Fire, there's just evil for the sake of being evil and giving our good guys a character to fight against, I would bet it's Euron, because I really don't see a logical explanation as to why he is doing all the things that he is, but who knows, maybe George R. R. Martin will shock us if we ever hopefully get The Winds of Winter. Now, the biggest question mark for me as to are these characters black and white evil, or is there more to them, is actually the others. We really don't know much about them, but I would bet that there is definitely some type of weird explanation as to why they're doing the things that they are doing. Granted, they could just be an evil force that is looming over the entire story as an existential threat that is truly going to destroy the world, but I don't think so. There is so much interesting lore with the Children of the Forest and everything going on with the old gods. I would stake a lot on the idea that they are not just evil for the sake of evil, that they aren't just trying to take over the world for the very simple fact of taking over the world. It just doesn't feel very George R. R. Martin to me, and I definitely believe that if we ever receive The Winds of Winter, the others, what they want, why they are so nasty to begin with, will be one of the things that is explained the most in the book since it's titled The Winds of Winter and the Others Are the Winter. But seriously, this idea of characters not being black and white, good or evil, applies to literally everyone. Even the Dothraki, they're a very brutal culture that do a lot of killing, a lot of raping, a lot of pillaging, have some qualities that aren't pure evil, that aren't as black and white as people make it seem, or as black and white as I have made them seem in the past, to be quite honest. And this applies to the wildlings as well. When we first hear about the wildlings in A Game of Thrones and in A Clash of Kings, they're talked about as this vile group of people who are animalistic and otherworldly, just not human, just the worst of the worst. And when Jon ventures beyond the wall and actually lives with them and experiences life with them on the day-to-day, he understands that, no, these are just people. There are good people, there are bad people, there are everything in between, and at the end of the day, we are all just people. We are all very similar, and our differences are more minute than people think that they are. And I really do believe that this aspect of George R. R. Martin's story is what makes it so special. Because all of these characters aren't black and white, because they all have some type of sympathetic backstory or some type of human element, you're able to relate to them and understand them on a much deeper level, which is why I take this so seriously, because I very much do feel the way in which you feel about characters in A Song of Ice and Fire can have a one-to-one reflection as to the way you feel about real people in the real world and real ideas in the real world, because at the end of the day, George is basing his story off of the real world. But with all that being said, if you've made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Please let me know in the comments what kind of videos you want to see from this channel in the future. With this video, I will probably take the most liked video recommendation and do that video at some point this week. And I do have a Discord server that I always plug, tell people to join, because I always take requests there, and I'm decently active when I have the time. I also do have a Patreon that I started recently. The link is in my bio. And please only donate to me if you have an excess of money to give away. Do not give me any money if you have any responsibilities that come before me. Please, the world is crazy right now. Inflation is way too high, and we can't be spending money that we don't have. But if you have an excess and you want to free me up some more time, that way I can work on more videos for you, I really appreciate it. More than you know, and I will probably do something soon where I give out my video scripts early to my Patreon, that way people can see it, and even critique me if they'd like. So with all that being said, if you've made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next one. Peace.